A king ordered soldiers to slaughter sacred cows and smash Buddhist statues inside a royal palace. Not over land, not over religion, over a tree bark you probably have sitting in your kitchen cabinet right now. For 300 years, 3 separate European empires fought, betrayed, enslaved, and burned entire regions to control a single spice. And almost nobody who sprinkles it on their coffee today has any idea what it actually cost. This is the history of cinnamon, the bark that colonial powers went to war to control. You already know cinnamon. You have used it 100 times without thinking twice. It goes into cinnamon rolls. It flavors your latte. It sits in a little glass jar next to the paprika. Completely unremarkable, completely forgettable. Most people assume it has always been this ordinary, cheap, boring, a spice rack afterthought. But that assumption is about to fall apart completely. Because for most of human history, cinnamon was not boring. It was one of the most dangerous, most valuable, most fought-over substances on Earth. And the story of how it got from priceless to forgettable is stranger than almost anyone realizes. Let's start at the surface. The part everyone half remembers from a documentary somewhere. Cinnamon comes from the inner bark of a tree, peeled, dried, and curled into the thin sticks you recognize today. Ancient Egyptians used it in embalming rituals as early as 2000 BCE, believing it helped preserve the body for the afterlife. It shows up in the Bible, used in sacred anointing oil. In ancient Rome, cinnamon was valued so highly that a modern equivalent price would run close to $3,000 per pound. That part, most people vaguely know. Expensive spice, ancient world, seems obvious. But the actual scale of that value is where it gets strange. In the year 1439, records show that an average worker needed 3 full days of labor just to earn enough money to buy a single pound of cinnamon, not a month's supply. 1 pound of dried bark curled into sticks, sitting in a merchant's stall. Roman emperors reportedly burned enormous quantities of it at state funerals as a display of wealth so extreme that ordinary citizens could only watch from a distance. Physicians across the ancient world prescribed cinnamon for ailments ranging from digestive problems to poor circulation, treating it less like a seasoning and more like medicine reserved for people who could actually afford to be healed. If a spice costs that much, somebody is making an enormous amount of money moving it. And for well over 1,000 years, one group made absolutely sure nobody else could compete. Here's what almost nobody knows. For over 1,000 years, nobody in Europe knew where cinnamon actually came from. And that ignorance was not an accident. It was engineered. Arab traders controlled the entire supply chain from source to European market, and they protected that monopoly with one of the most successful disinformation campaigns in ancient history. The Greek historian Herodotus recorded a story Arab merchants told to explain cinnamon's origin. According to the tale, giant birds built their nests out of cinnamon sticks on impossibly high, inaccessible cliffs. To get the spice, traders supposedly had to lure the birds down using heavy chunks of meat, causing the nests to collapse under the weight so the cinnamon could be collected from the ground. It was completely invented, and it worked for centuries. Nobody in Rome or Greece questioned it, because nobody had any way to check. The actual source, the island we now call Sri Lanka, stayed hidden behind myth and middlemen for over 1,000 years. Whoever controlled the secret controlled the price. And whoever controlled the price controlled enormous wealth. Think about what that actually required. Every shipment of cinnamon that reached a Roman or Greek market had already passed through the hands of multiple traders, each one adding a markup, each one bound by silence about where the previous leg of the journey had actually begun. Arab merchants moved the spice through a chain of ports stretching from the Indian Ocean through the Red Sea and into the Mediterranean. And at no point along that chain did a buyer in Europe ever meet anyone who had actually seen the tree it grew on. It is one of the longest-running trade secrets in recorded history, protected not by walls or armies, but by geography, distance, and a story about giant birds that nobody could disprove. But secrets do not last forever, and when this one finally broke, it did not lead to fair trade or open markets. It led to conquest. In 1505, a Portuguese fleet under the command of Lourenço de Almeida was blown wildly off course by a storm in the Indian Ocean. When the weather cleared, his ships had drifted onto the shores of an island the Portuguese had never planned to visit, Ceylon, the true, long-hidden source of the world's finest cinnamon. What happened next moved fast, and it moved brutally. Within just over a decade, the Portuguese had seized control of the coastal cinnamon trade through a mix of military pressure and coercive deals with local rulers. They did not simply buy cinnamon, they took it. By 1518, they had built fortified strongholds along the coast, specifically to guard cinnamon-growing territory, treating a tree bark with the same military seriousness most empires reserved for gold mines or strategic ports. And to keep production running at the volume European markets now demanded, they turned to forced labor, conscripting an entire community, known as the Salagama, into permanent cinnamon-peeling servitude. This is where the story stops being about spice and starts being about human cost. Boys as young as 12 were forced into the forests to strip bark by hand, required to deliver fixed quotas that increased as they aged, with brutal punishment awaiting anyone who fell short. Before the Portuguese arrived, only the head of a household had been obligated to perform this labor. The Portuguese expanded that burden across entire families, entire generations, entire villages, all to keep pace with a European appetite for a spice most consumers back home had never questioned the origin of. Records from this period describe entire villages organized around nothing but the extraction of one plant's inner bark, their lives structured year-round by delivery quotas set by administrators who had never once set foot outside a coastal fort. A missed quota did not simply mean a warning. It meant beatings, imprisonment, or worse, enforced by a colonial power thousands of miles from anyone who might hold it accountable. For over a century, this was simply how cinnamon was made. And then, in the 1600s, a new and far more calculating power arrived to take it away. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, did not attack the Portuguese directly at first. Instead, in 1638, Dutch representatives approached the King of Kandy, the last independent Sinhalese kingdom on the island, with an offer: help us drive out the Portuguese, and we will hand the reclaimed coastal territory back to your crown. The king agreed. A formal treaty was signed, and for a moment, it looked like liberation. It was not. Dutch and Kandyan forces fought together, capturing Portuguese strongholds one by one, culminating in the fall of the crucial cinnamon port of Galle in 1640. The alliance had worked exactly as planned. But when the King of Kandy arrived expecting to finally reclaim his coastal lands as promised, he found something else waiting for him. Dutch soldiers occupying the forts, Dutch administrators moving into Portuguese houses, Dutch officials claiming direct ownership of the very cinnamon-growing land they had sworn to return. The betrayal was not accidental. Investigators comparing the treaty's original language centuries later found something chilling. A crucial clause limiting Dutch claims, promising the king final say over the territory, existed in the Sinhala version of the agreement. It had been quietly left out of the Dutch copy. That single missing clause is arguably one of history's most consequential acts of small print. The Dutch had no intention of ever leaving. They had invested too much money and blood to hand a monopoly this profitable back to a local king. The first real breaking point came just a few decades later. In 1670, the Dutch governor at the time set his sights on land deep in Kandyan territory, hoping to cut the kingdom off from the coast entirely and lock down the cinnamon trade for good. Dutch forces pushed inland, building small forts and gradually annexing territory the Kandyan king had assumed was safely his. For years, the king did nothing. Dutch officials openly mocked him as too weak to respond. Then, in August of 1670, he responded. Kandyan forces attacked the newly built Dutch forts one after another. The fighting dragged on for 5 years, with the king even convincing a passing French naval fleet to help block Dutch reinforcements by sea. It did not work. The French were defeated and forced to surrender within months. But the war ground on regardless, ending only in a stalemate that satisfied nobody and settled nothing. It was simply the opening chapter of a conflict that would keep reigniting for the next century. What followed was not peace. It was over a century of simmering resentment that periodically exploded into open war. This is where the story gets darker than most people expect. Kandyan forces launched repeated uprisings throughout the late 1600s and again through the 1700s, driven largely by outrage over forced labor conditions on the cinnamon plantations and Dutch land seizures, disguised as administrative reform. In 1760, cinnamon peelers and local farmers, pushed past their limit, rose up in open revolt against Dutch expropriation of newly planted lands. The uprising spread. The Kandyan king backed it. Full-scale war broke out, dragging in irregular fighters from villages that had never before taken up arms against a colonial power. By 1761, Kandyan forces had captured the Matara fort, forcing Dutch troops to retreat, holding the territory for nearly a year. For a brief moment, it looked as though the kingdom might actually reverse a century of humiliation. The Dutch response, when it came, was devastating. In February of 1765, Dutch colonial forces marched inland along routes normally kept secret by Kandyan guides, specifically to prevent this kind of invasion. Governor Van Eck personally led thousands of troops, drawing on soldiers recruited from across the Dutch trading empire, from Java to southern India, in a coordinated push toward the Kandyan capital itself. What they did once inside is rarely mentioned in polite summaries of colonial trade history. Soldiers slaughtered sacred cows. They destroyed Buddhist statues inside the royal temple. They plundered the palace, stripping it of treasures, including a ceremonial cannon that would not be returned to Sri Lanka for over 250 years. The occupation did not even last. Dutch forces abandoned the captured capital within months, unable to hold territory this deep in hostile, mountainous terrain. They had won a battle that cost them almost nothing to lose and destroyed almost everything the Kandyan kingdom held sacred in the process. All of it, ultimately, to protect a monopoly on flavored tree bark. If a story like this surprises you, imagine what else gets left out of the version taught in school. Subscribe, because we go looking for exactly these buried details every single week. The Dutch held on to their cinnamon monopoly for 140 years. And then, just like the Portuguese before them, they lost it to forces completely outside their control. In 1796, as the Napoleonic Wars tore Europe apart, British forces seized Dutch colonial territory in Ceylon, almost as a side effect of a war being fought thousands of miles away over completely different stakes. The British inherited a monopoly built on generations of forced labor, broken treaties, and suppressed rebellion, and for the next 4 decades, they saw little reason to change the underlying system. By 1799, the British had secured the prime cinnamon lands around Colombo. They maintained a state monopoly on the trade until 1833, when the economics of the situation had finally shifted so far that holding on no longer made financial sense. But the British made one decision that quietly finished what the Dutch and Portuguese had spent 3 centuries protecting against. They began deliberately planting cinnamon outside Ceylon, establishing new estates in territories they controlled directly, including a large plantation near Kandy on the Indian mainland. For the first time in recorded history, the plant that had defined an island's fate for 300 years was no longer a geographic secret at all. It could be grown almost anywhere the climate allowed, by anyone with the seeds and the land. Here is the twist almost nobody sees coming. Cinnamon's centuries-long reign as a geopolitical prize did not end because the world became more ethical. It ended because the secret got out one final time, in the worst possible way for the people who had spent 300 years protecting it. European powers eventually planted cinnamon in other tropical colonies entirely outside Ceylon, breaking the island's natural monopoly for good. Even more consequential, a cheaper, harsher, less refined relative of true cinnamon, called Cassia, began flooding global markets from regions like China and Indonesia. Cassia was easier to grow, cheaper to ship, and close enough in flavor that most average consumers could not tell the difference, or simply did not care to. By the 1800s, the very spice that empires had bled and betrayed each other over was becoming commercially irrelevant. Prices collapsed. What was once worth more than gold became, within a few generations, one of the cheapest items in a grocery store spice aisle. Today, the irony is almost impossible to overstate. Indonesia, not Sri Lanka, is now the world's single largest producer of cinnamon, primarily growing cassia rather than what historians and chefs still call true cinnamon. Roughly 90% of the cinnamon sold in stores worldwide under that familiar name is actually cassia, a different, harsher, more coumarin-heavy plant entirely, not the original Ceylon variety that three empires bled for. Which means most people pouring cinnamon into their coffee or their oatmeal this morning are not even tasting the spice that started any of this. There is one more wrinkle, and it matters more than most people realize. Cassia, the cheaper variety now dominating global supply, contains significantly higher levels of a natural compound called coumarin than true Ceylon cinnamon does. In large or prolonged doses, coumarin can place real strain on the liver. Health agencies in several countries have issued specific guidance limiting daily cassia intake for exactly this reason. The empire-grade spice that once required a war to obtain has been quietly replaced by a cheaper stand-in that, ounce for ounce, may actually carry more risk to the people consuming it. Let's come back up to the surface for a moment. You already knew cinnamon was old. You already knew it was once expensive. What you probably did not know is that behind that little glass jar sits a myth invented to protect a monopoly, a broken treaty hidden in a mistranslation, a forced labor system that trapped children as young as 12, a war that ended with sacred cows slaughtered inside a royal palace, and a final commercial collapse so total that most of what carries the name today is not even the same plant. Think about the sheer number of separate, unrelated forces it took to get one small spice jar onto a modern grocery shelf for a few dollars. A storm that blew a fleet off course by accident. A king who trusted the wrong ally. A clerk who left one clause out of a translated treaty, whether by carelessness or deliberate design. Farmers who finally reached a breaking point after a century of forced labor. A war fought over land grabs disguised as tax policy. A completely different, cheaper plant from an entirely different part of the world that quietly stepped in and took over an industry built on 300 years of blood. None of that was inevitable. Every one of those moments could have gone differently, and if even one of them had, the spice sitting in your kitchen right now might not exist in its current form at all, or might still cost a worker 3 days' wages instead of a few coins. A spice this ordinary, sitting this quietly in your kitchen, has a body count and a paper trail most people will never learn. So here's the question nobody has fully answered. If a substance this common, this overlooked, this seemingly harmless, was worth 3 empires' worth of blood and betrayal, what does that say about the rest of your spice rack? Cloves and nutmeg have their own war stories. arguably even stranger and bloodier than this one, involving entire islands traded away in treaties over a single tiny speck of land barely 2 miles wide. We have not told those yet. There is also a quieter question worth sitting with. The next time Cassia, not true cinnamon, shows up in something you eat, you are tasting the winner of a 300-year war you never knew was fought, sold to you under a name that was never really its own. Somewhere between colonial monopoly and modern supermarket shelf, an entire history got compressed into a $2 spice jar, and the label never once mentions any of it. If you want to find out what those other spices are hiding and how many more ordinary kitchen items have histories buried underneath them, you already know what to do. Subscribe, and let's go looking for the next one together.